A drone attack on Khartoum's international airport. The UN says such strikes have killed nearly 900 people in Sudan this year, and the conflict between the army and paramilitary groups only intensifying. So is there hope for an end to the fighting? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Anna Burns-Francis. Divided by fighting, desperate for peace. 3 years of conflict in Sudan has caused one of the worst humanitarian crises in recent times. The UN says 14 million people have been displaced. Nearly half of Sudan's population is facing acute hunger, and more than 18 million people need urgent medical help for injuries and disease. Aid groups have also accused the warring parties, the army and the paramilitary rapid support forces, of using sexual violence as a weapon of war. But the prospect of negotiations to stop the fighting in Sudan appear dim. Why has the army and the RSF failed to come to the table? Is the involvement of foreign players complicating mediation efforts? We'll discuss these issues with our guests shortly, but first, this report by Michael Apple.
In Sudan, one of the world's most devastating conflicts is descending into what rights groups warn is an even more dangerous phase. More than 3 years of fighting between the Sudanese army and paramilitary rapid support forces has caused a displacement crisis and humanitarian catastrophe.
We strongly condemn the rising use of armed drones in Sudan.
The UN reporting drone strikes have killed at least 880 civilians in the first 4 months of this year. RSF drone strikes recently targeted Khartoum International Airport. The army accused 2 foreign governments of involvement.
What Ethiopia and the UAE have done is direct aggression against Sudan and won't be met with silence.
Both Ethiopia and the UAE have rejected the accusations. Areas of control continue to shift. The army dominates the north, east and central regions, including the capital, while the RSF controls most of the western Darfur region, much of Kordofan and parts of the south. The conflict continues to cause untold civilian suffering, with both sides accused of perpetrating crimes against humanity and war crimes. An independent international UN fact-finding mission recently warned that RSF actions around Al Fasher, the capital city of North Darfur state, bear the hallmarks of genocide. These include mass atrocities targeting non-Arab communities based on their ethnicity, gender, and political affiliation. Aid agencies say more than 33 million Sudanese people are enduring what the UN calls the world's largest hunger crisis.
Resources are going into conflict rather than dealing with the people in such great need.
The UN's humanitarian chief arguing that the billions of dollars spent on wars could help all of Sudan and more for an entire year. Instead, a humanitarian disaster is growing worse, compounded by the increased use of drones, now the leading cause of civilian deaths in Sudan. Michael Apple, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Well, to discuss this further, let's bring in our guests from Grenoble in France. Caroline Bouvard, the country director of the Sudan mission of Solidarites International. In Sarajevo, Kholood Khair, she is the founding director at Confluence Advisory, a think tank focused on Sudan and founded in Khartoum. And in Washington, D.C., Cameron Hudson. He's the former director for African Affairs at the U.S. National Security Council. A very warm welcome to all three of you. Kholood, I will start with you. Drones are said at this point to have caused 80% of civilian Sudanese deaths in the first 4 months of this year. You have family and friends there. What is life like for them right now?
I think the unpredictability of the drones is also part of the terror that people feel with their increased usage. You know, at least with the sort of traditional large Antonov airplanes, you can hear them coming from far away, you can hide. But what a lot of people are saying is that, you know, we don't hear them and then suddenly there's a loud boom and it's usually civilian sites that are targeted, whether it's markets, hospitals, communal areas. And so there's a real sort of sense of terror, frankly, that, you might be killed or injured or maimed with something you don't see coming, and that has been that is being used by all sides in this conflict at all times. And there's usually no stop, even during the rainy season, where we usually see some level of petering off of deaths. But one thing I want to make clear is that the civilians are the target in this. This is not, sort of incidental damage to civilians and civilian targets. We are seeing civilians being actively targeted because this is a war against civilians.
Caroline, can you speak to that? A war against civilians, because we don't often think of any conflict as one side going after the civilian population, and yet what we are seeing and what is being described does seem to match that.
Well, one thing that is certain is that civilian infrastructure and civilians themselves have not been spared by either the drone attacks or more generally the ground attacks. So there are definitely not necessarily always targets, but they are the casualties, the main casualties of this war. And we see it every day when we look at the type of infrastructures that have been attacked by both sides, whether it is a hospital or it is a market. Obviously, you've got civilians there. So they are the first victim of the conflict and the first victim of these different attacks, for sure.
Cameron, can I bring you in here? You recently testified at the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee that no corner of the country is safe. How would you describe the warfare or the use of drones with what we're seeing between the RSF and the SAF?
Well, I think it's fairly unprecedented, certainly in the African context. I think the only other place where we're seeing this level of drone activity is in the Russia-Ukraine war. But I think this is a measure of what a 21st century war looks like, where especially when you have even non-state actors backed by state actors. As a matter of fact, in the last few weeks, we have seen drone-on-drone attacks using the same drones provided and manufactured in Turkey, but drone-on-drone attacks using the same drones over the skies in Sudan. So, there's clearly a profit motive at play here as well by the outside backers of this war on both sides of the war, selling weapons in. So the availability of these weapons, I think, has obviously changed the shape of the war, but also the fact that there really is no kind of code of conduct for how these weapons are used. There's very little training for how these weapons are used. And so you run the risk, and as we've seen in Sudan, this war is being defined by the civilian casualties that are being caused by these drones.
Yeah. Kholood, can I bring you in here? Because Cameron's just spoken about the profit motive here, but the fact there is no training, there is no code of conduct. And so, of course, it would not be unexpected to think that civilians would be caught up. The UN reported that between January and April this year, health facilities were hit 4 times. Can we assume that that is a deliberate targeting, or that is a casualty of a war where there is no training for either side, and that this is a recent development that drones have overtaken the sphere of this conflict?
I think both are true. Neither the SAF nor the RSF particularly care about the lives of civilians. They have not shown historically that they do. In fact, they have targeted civilians in every war they have been involved in since the creation of the RSF, certainly, and since the creation of the SAF, sort of at Sudan's independence. So there is a historical legacy here of not caring about civilians. Certainly, the fact that you have a lot of drone technologies that are evolving very quickly mean that not all drones that make it into Sudan, whether they are coming from Turkey or Iran or China or elsewhere, are going to be, known how to be used by those on the ground. But the war in Sudan is not just sort of a war between different factions of Bashir's military security state trying to fight it out over, power and access to resources. This is also a counter-revolutionary war. We're seeing very clearly how the SAF and RSF have targeted civic structures, whether it's, mutual aid volunteers, whether it's unions, for example, like doctors, journalists, particularly journalists, whether it's sort of civic structures at the social level or the political level, they have been part and parcel of how this war is prosecuted. And this war, if you remember, follows a coup in 2021 precisely against the civic demands of the Sudanese population. And so for me, both of these things are true. There is an absolute distinct lack of training, as well as a historical legacy of not caring about civilian casualties. But there's also an active targeting of civilians, be that through drones or other means.
Yeah. Caroline, I saw you nodding a couple of times there in response to some of the things Kholood was saying. What are the reports that you are hearing from your team on the ground about the civilians and what they are suffering through these drone attacks?
Well, I mean, currently we basically have daily drone attacks in Darfur. I was myself in Khartoum last week, and we also had drone attacks there. And in every cases, there has been civilian casualties. So it is not as indiscriminate as when we used to have the barrel bombings at the beginning of the war, which really fell in the middle of not like civilian areas and would make major casualties. It's less people, but it is still too many people, basically. And it creates, in addition, a real fear amongst the population, amongst our teams as well. Because in reality, every time they see a drone coming in and hovering above one of the cities, it creates a general panic because people do not know where they will target, what they will target, and what will happen. And there is no real way to protect yourself. So today, for example, I was receiving messages from my team in Jazeera, where there's been 2 drone attacks at the beginning of the afternoon. And one of them was in a market area. And I had my HR manager telling me, the cook is actually at the market right now. She's purchasing the food for the team. And we don't have contact with her. So it creates a general sense of fear because you do not know where it will come and what will happen exactly. And this is obviously extremely complicated for the population to manage.
Yeah. And was your cook all right? Did they return from the market?
Our cook came back safe, yes, yeah. For sure.
Which must be a relief every time. Cameron, can I bring you in here?
Sorry, you say?
I just said it must be a relief every time that you get one of those messages as well at the same time. Cameron, can I ask you, what is it when you hear Caroline talking about how those drones impact that civilian population? But in terms of the warfare, what is it about their use in Sudan that has made this conflict so much more difficult to mediate or to navigate or to find an end point?
Well, I don't know that the drones have made it harder. I think the drones and their use is a function of the lack of progress at any kind of negotiating table. And so as these negotiations have sort of dragged on and not really gained a lot of traction, you are seeing other countries backing one side or the other, taking more advantage of those opportunities to try to press an advantage in this war, either through the introduction of new weapons or the creation of new transport routes. So we have seen, for example, in the last few years, transport routes coming in from virtually every neighboring state surrounding Sudan, and most recently, weapons flow coming in from Ethiopia, opening a new front in this war in the Blue Nile state of Sudan. So as the negotiations for a ceasefire have really not borne any fruit, what you're seeing is an expansion of the scope of the war, an expansion of those participating in the war, and an expansion of the weapons that are being used to bring into this war. And I think we all said this at the very beginning of this conflict, that if it was allowed to drag on, which it has, it would drag on for many, many years, and it would proliferate across the region and even beyond the Horn of Africa. We're seeing many Red Sea state actors and Gulf state actors participating in this conflict right now, and that just makes it more and more difficult to try to reach any kind of mediated end, because you're no longer just trying to mediate among the warring parties, you're trying to mediate now among all of their backers and their competing interests as well.
Yeah, I want to come back to you on that, but Kholood, can I come to you first, because that it was almost a canary in the coal mine type warning from Cameron there, that this sounds like a conflict that is only going to expand and get bigger and drag in more parties. Do you share that concern?
Yes, as Cameron said, many of us have been saying this since the start of the war, that actually what we're seeing is that the internal fraying in Sudan is inviting many of these actors in, and they already have very predatory social and foreign policies towards Sudan and towards the Horn of Africa region in general. When you look at the different countries in the Horn of Africa, the countries that have internal disagreements that they are unable to resolve are the ones that have the biggest share, if you will, of into the predation from the region. They have the largest number of actors, often competing actors, involved in their affairs. And this is sort of a very toxic mix of internal instability that drives a lot of violence, and then the external support to that violence that keeps the war going. But we also have to remember that as well as the regional level, sort of the dynamics that Cameron described, as well as the sort of the national level conflicts that we're seeing in Sudan, chiefly between the SAF and the RSF, there are also hyper-local and local dynamics that are almost entirely missing from any mediation sort of calculation. And that is actually what's driving a lot of the recruitment, a lot of the hate speech, a lot of the violence that we're seeing, a lot of the sexual violence that we're seeing. And unless that hyper-local and local level of conflict dynamics is taking into account during mediation sort of settings and during mediation talks, we're not going to be able to see those talks actually bring something that can get traction in the country in terms of resolving this conflict, or at least mitigating and de-escalating a lot of this violence.
Talk to me more about that hyperlocal. What are you specifically referring to?
So, for example, if one of the sort of turning points in this war, if you will, particularly in terms of just the scale of the violence, was the Al-Fashir takeover of Al-Fashir by the RSF last year. Now, what we saw, what was driving a lot of the violence at that time were the hyperlocal and local considerations, for particularly around who has access to land and who doesn't. Some groups felt that other groups, particularly the sort of non-Arab groups, had more of a share of, resources, ministries, power, effectively, in the Juba Peace Agreement of 2020. And a lot of the violence that we saw in Al-Fashir last year was driven by a desire to settle scores with those groups. It is also about, of course, removing people from land and sort of ethnic cleansing in order to get access to land. And those issues have been going on for, sort of decades. And the way that this war now provides cover for a lot of those local tensions to not just arise, but continue, means that you see this very dangerous way of local feeding into the regional, feeding into the national, and vice versa. Again, not focusing on that those conflict drivers at the national and at the local level is, I think, one of the key reasons why there is no mediation track currently that is able to gain any traction.
And so, Caroline, listening to that and from what you know of what is happening, what is your concern for the human toll that this conflict will have?
Well, there is definitely several layers in this conflict, that's for sure. And indeed, the fact that you do have also some local fights between different subgroups adds some additional risk and threat and unpredictability in terms of the impact on the population and on the people that we have working there, actually. So our main concern is indeed to see further displacement of populations in areas where we thought that the situation was more stable, because the main two parties actually had stopped fighting there. So areas such as most of the Darfur states, for example, and where we could see, because of local, more localized conflict, like we've seen, for example, in North Darfur, around Kabia, around the areas where the Mohammed tribes are most present, where there has been some additional conflict coming in, local conflict coming in, and leading to more displacement of population. So the situation was already complicated enough in terms of accessing population, making sure that the people who had been displaced could benefit from humanitarian aid. But when you add up this layer also of more localized conflict, you make it even more complicated. And there are some pockets of territories where we could have accessed a few months back and cannot access anymore, where we do know some displaced population can have taken refuge. So that makes it even more complicated, obviously, in terms of humanitarian intervention.
Of course. Cameron, can we broaden this back out again? And you referred to this a little in your previous answer. The foreign actors that are involved in this conflict, is there any motivation for them to sit down and agree to end the conflict at this point?
Well, they haven't demonstrated an interest in doing so. I think they're going through the motions, so they're giving the appearance that they are engaged in these talks. They even issue statements condemning the participation of foreign actors in this war, of which they're speaking about themselves. So there's a certain degree of hypocrisy, I think, behind these mediation efforts right now. That we have to call out. I think the challenge is that they're being led by the United States right now, and the United States has been more interested in trying to keep all of these actors on side, has not wanted to draw a line in the sand and compel its friends and allies to suspend their support to one side or the other. But it's going to take that level of political and diplomatic courage to do that, to require countries to suspend their support for one side. But again, nobody wants to do that until they have some assurance of what is going to emerge from this conflict. And I think that as long as that continues, then the only thing we're guaranteed to see is a continuation of the fighting that's been going on right now.
Isn't that a bit chicken and egg, that somebody has to change in order for things on the ground to change, but nobody wants to do that until things on the ground change?
Well, right, and so we're sort of stuck in this cul-de-sac of violence that we are not able to escape from. And I think that one of the challenges is that Sudan has not risen to the level of international priority that other conflicts have, and I think we ignore at our own peril the strategic risks of seeing Sudan further disintegrate and further instability in the Red Sea. I think, if anything, that the Iran war has taught policymakers is that the Red Sea and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait are every bit as precarious right now as the Strait of Hormuz. And so there really should be greater effort to resolve the conflict in Sudan before we really start to see, I think, a spiraling of the effects of this war that are no longer simply contained to Sudan and the border regions that it has, but really spreading across a much wider region of the territory there.
Kholood, can I ask you, I hate to strike a tone of pessimism here, but if we bring it back to the drones and their impact on this conflict in particular, do you see their use expanding and having a more devastating effect from this point forward? Is there any hope you have that the conflict will resolve with the line or the path that it's going down at the moment?
No, and I don't think it's pessimism. I think that you're reading the tea leaves pretty well. I mean, when it comes to the drones, the concern here is that not only will we get, sort of more drones by volume entering the country, but the drones in general, in terms of the world market, will become cheaper to produce. Sometimes maybe even other groups will have the ability to produce them locally using sort of scrap metal or whatever is available, which means that you also then sort of proliferate the use and ownership of drones amongst other groups, for example, militias, smaller militias, ethnic militias, and of course those groups are not bound by any international humanitarian law for whatever that's worth in today's age. And so what you effectively have is that drones become the new AK-47s. Everybody gets access to them, and as time goes on, the technologies become sort of more deadly, more accessible. And then what you have is that the sort of geographic fragmentation, the political fragmentation that you're seeing in Sudan also becomes sort of a military fragmentation that is very difficult to put back together should a peace agreement then be made. But of course, the proliferation of drones also makes it more difficult to get to a consensus around a peace deal, because different groups smaller groups suddenly start to get way more leverage. And so this tendency towards fragmentation, I think, is both being catalyzed by drone usage, but also is being, drone usage is being catalyzed by the fragmentation. And again, it's another noxious mix that unfortunately means that this war does not look like at its current rate and that it will be resolved anytime soon.
Caroline, when you hear comments like that from Kholood, and as the country director of Sudan, that there are other conflicts around the world, does that concern you, that the spread of drones may have an impact in other conflicts as well, that this is the new future of warfare?
Yeah, actually, I mean, Obviously, we've seen, I've been in Sudan since the end of 2024. There was no drones there. And I've seen the difference in terms of capacities of the different parties to reach areas where people felt relatively safe, even if they were in a country at war. And even if these drones are extremely expensive, they're actually not that expensive compared to any other kind of weapons. So it is very probable that they will be used more and more by including non-state groups that just manage to have enough money basically to buy them or have backers who are providing them these drones. And the impact that it has on the conflict is definitely more than worrisome for any country in the world that is facing civil war or external conflicts, for sure.
Kholood, just quickly then, for your final thoughts, is this a race to the bottom?
Absolutely, and it has been since the beginning. I think part of the problem is that for all the ills that we're seeing in Sudan, the world's largest hunger crisis, the world's largest humanitarian crisis, the world's largest displacement crisis, the world's largest sexual violence crisis is just not permeating on the agendas of global leaders, which means that those who do have some ability, at least, to get the ducks in a row, at least at the international level, are not doing so. And really, this is, I think, an abrogation of responsibility by world leaders, across the board, whether it's more locally within the IGAD region, the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, within the African Union, or more broadly within UN member states. And so, what the people of Sudan are feeling right now is that they're effectively being left alone to face the, very brutal conflict that is playing out at various levels, including, of course, with the inclusion of international actors themselves.
Cameron, just very quickly, I have about 30 seconds left. So do you agree, I guess is the easiest way of putting this, with Kholood's sentiment that this is an international obligation that has been abdicated so far?
I think there's no other way to look at it. I think that, when you look at previous wars in Sudan, whether it's the North-South Civil War or the Darfur genocide, you saw a very robust international involvement, not just from the United States, but from the United Nations, the African Union, the regional organization IGAD. You saw a coming together of the international community to resolve those conflicts. You're just not seeing those today.
Cameron Hudson joining us from Washington, D.C., Kholood Khair joining us from Sarajevo, and Caroline Bouvard joining us from Grenoble. Thank you all. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for more discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on X. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Anna Burns-Francis, and the team here. Al Jazeera's coverage continues in a moment. Stay tuned.